the same subject. The first thing is that in the dependent arising, does not address contact actually. It just goes right away to mentality and materiality, and also that it goes from consciousness back to mentality and materiality, which is different as it usually is. And I have already explained that. Another thing that's different is that the Buddha talks about descriptions and considerations of self. Now I've already talked about that and explained that, the consideration of self. And when we will talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, that description of self will come back as another aspect of that. And the another thing which is quite different is that when he finishes with talking about feeling and the pathway for designation and language and description, then he goes to the 7 stations of consciousness. Now these 7 stations of consciousness, of course, are described in many different suttas, but always in a different way. This is the only time that they're described like this. And the 7 stations of consciousness have several implications. They have the implication of our consciousness as we are now. They have the implication of different realms of being, and they have the implication of the jhanas. So I'll just read what the Buddha says about each one of them. It's called the 7 stations for consciousness. Ananda, there are these 7 stations for consciousness and 2 bases. What are the 7? There are, Ananda, beings who are diverse in body and diverse in perception, such as human beings, all different bodies and different ideas. Some gods, some beings in the lower realms. This is the 1st station for consciousness. Well, that's the kind of consciousness that everybody knows inside out. That's a marketplace consciousness. That's the one everybody lives with constantly, from morning to night, and tries to get away from it through meditation. But that's the one that is totally known to every human being and totally unsatisfactory, of course. But very few human beings know that it's entirely up to them to change that consciousness. We don't have to stick around with it. It's also the kind of consciousness that the beings in the lower realms have. Now again, all the different realms, 31 of them, are levels of consciousness. So we've got hell realms. Well, that's a level of consciousness. And if we behave badly enough, we can experience it right here and now. And if we can't get our negativities out of the mind, we can experience it right here and now. So we don't have to wait to go down below there, wherever that's supposed to be. Now there are beings in the hell realms that remain there. They have that kind of consciousness. It's not that it's permanent, they can get out, but they have a sort of found an abode there. And that's happening. We know all about these things. We can actually have their books written about it. And then there are lower realms, which are called the hungry ghosts and the titans. Well, there are 2 different levels, and the hungry ghosts are people, or no, I should say beings, that are so full of craving that they can never get enough. And they really have a dreadful time. And one could say that on our level here, the one that we know, such beings very often become drug addicts or alcoholics. The craving is so strong, there's no way that they can ever have any satisfaction. They are depicted, and you can find them on that picture in the back there, as sort of like stick beings that have very fat tummies sticking out and tiny little throats. So they are terribly hungry, but they've got such tiny little throats and tiny little mouths, they can never get enough in. Well, that's just a symbolic way of making them appear. And then there's the titans. The titans are sort of gods. This is what the Buddha is saying here, some gods. But we always have the idea that gods are something wonderful, and maybe we even think there's one that's looking after everything. But that isn't working out, we might have noticed by now. But these gods, Titans, are forever fighting. Well, there are people around that are forever fighting. And they're very strong. The Titans have a sort of a strength, and the strength is not used for anything constructive. It's used for something destructive. And we have seen that in this century plenty of times. Strength, power being used destructively. That's Titans. And then the next thing is animals. It's the only ones that most people can see other than human beings. And so we have this idea, there is nothing else. They're humans and animals. Because we have the idea that everything that exists we can see with our physical eye. Well, obviously, that's absurd. We can see with our mental eye so many things that we can never see with our physical eye. Never mind anything other than that. Even with the mental eye, when we have some abstract ideas, we can't see them. They're just abstract ideas. So whatever is with the physical eye is very limited. So that's human beings and animals. And again, it's a level of consciousness, and there are, of course, human beings that have that kind of level. There's no doubt about that. So we can say from that, maybe we can understand that every realm of existence is a level of consciousness. And this is what the Buddha is saying here, and he's saying more than that, but we'll get into that in a minute. He's showing that there are many levels, and these are all available to us. We can get to the lower ones very easy, no problem at all. And we can get to the higher ones, maybe not quite that easy, but also no problem. It's entirely up to us, namely to what we carry around in the mind, day in and day out. And the more we get attached to what we carry around in the mind because we believe it, the more we will get stuck on that level of consciousness. So that's one aspect of. And he's putting it into 7, not because the 31 realms are very often divided into 7. And if you look on that picture later, you will see that there are probably, I don't know, I can't see it from here, but there probably are 7 divisions. And all the different realms that exist are very often put into those 7. And there are first these lower ones, that's 1. And then we come to the human one, that's 2. And from those 31, we are number 5 from the bottom with the human consciousness. So if anybody will ever get surprised again about what goes on in the world, they've forgotten what they've heard here. They haven't even paid attention. Number 5 from the bottom, and that's the human consciousness. So we have directly below us the animals, and I'm sure we have all encountered human beings who have acted like animals at some time in their lives. It's not difficult to encounter them like that. So, and even lower than that. Then Titans, fighting, strength, destructive strength, and then the craving, and then below that, the hellish place where the suffering is very, very great. All levels of consciousness. So that's number 1 and number 2. But what it also means is this is the first station for consciousness, the Buddha says. So this is the worldly consciousness. This is where we think the world's going to do it for us. If everything works out fine, if nobody's going to be nasty, if nobody is going to take our money away, if we will stay healthy and don't get any back pains or whatever it may be, everything is going to be wonderful. Well, if we still believe that, we haven't listened properly. So that's the worldly consciousness. And in that world, if we try to find the satisfaction, then of course we probably wouldn't be meditating. Because even the attempt to meditate is already an admission, hopefully, that the world hasn't got it. It's a very low consciousness. If you just look at what I call the marketplace, if you look at the economic machinations in the world, if you look at the war machine, if you look at everything that is really happening, not just when we're sitting nicely and having a cup of coffee, but what's really happening in the world, you can see that the human and worldly consciousness is totally unsatisfactory. It cannot bring satisfaction, and that one really has to work oneself out of that. So then comes the next one. There are beings who are diverse in body, but identical in perception, such as the gods of the Brahma order, who are generated through the first jhana. This is the second station for consciousness. Now, the Buddha takes big leaps there, because he wants to put it all into the 7 stations of consciousness and 2 bases, which means the 8 jhanas. So he's putting all these different realms, which he explains in other discourses, in the number 31, he puts them into a lump. So this one here, and he's got a little table here showing what they are, somewhere here, put them all together. The second ones, they are called the great Brahmas, the gods of Brahma's ministries, and gods of Brahma's retinue. Now you have to remember, this is Indian. These are Indian explanations of what this is. But what it actually means is that these are beings that have the ability to generate and cultivate and depend on the 4 Brahma Viharas. Now you've all heard, hopefully, the 4 Brahma Viharas. Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These are called the 4 Brahma Viharas, the abodes of the gods. Brahma is gods, Vihara is abode, which means if we cultivate them and have them in our heart, and as human beings we have all the possibilities for all of the consciousnesses. We can have them all. And we often have 10 of them or more in one hour or less. So that consciousness of the Brahma Viharas brings one to a state of feeling very much at ease. You can say that it's like having a paradisical feeling within. It's at the same time, it also is likened to the first jhana, because the first jhana, when it's done properly, has also that kind of reflection afterwards that this was quite wonderful and beautiful and desirable, and that this is a totally different consciousness from the one that we usually have. Now, the consciousness that one has in meditation, when we put our attention on the breath, is a kind of an direction and a kind of tension and a kind of trying and having a certain hopefulness that's going to stay there and all that. Well, with the first jhana that all changes, and I have explained that already, that one passes the threshold of method. Until then it's all method and fairly meaningless. The only thing that it does, if one tries, is it makes good karma. There's no doubt about it. As long as we're trying, we're making good karma, because we have a valid intention. It's a meritorious intention to meditate. And with that, as soon as the mind can stay on the meditation subject for a moment, there is also that ability to let go of sloth and torpor and let go of impurity. But it isn't a change of consciousness, and it certainly has nothing to do with the proper purification which only takes place in the meditative absorptions. We will see at the end of all this that the meditative absorptions are the necessary ingredient for the pathway. as the Buddha will explain. They are the necessary ingredient to get the pathway to the point where one can actually have sufficient purification. So the Brahma Viharas, that inner cultivation of love and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity, makes it possible also to get into first jhana. Loving kindness is one of the best entrance possibilities. It is very often used by people, particularly those who don't go any further. It's very often used as an entry, but it's an excellent entry. So the loving kindness, which generates warmth in the heart region, can then be used, that warmth can be used as our entry point into the first jhana. So you can see the connection between this level of consciousness, which the Buddha calls the gods of the Brahma order, who are generated through the first jhana. So this is the level of consciousness of loving kindness, which generates first jhana, which is the Brahma Vihara. And this takes us away from worldly consciousness. Worldly consciousness has never yet, ever been satisfactory to anyone. It can't, because it's always connected with craving. I want something better than what I've got. Or, if I've got something nice, I want to keep it. So there's always wanting in it. So it can never be satisfying. So here, this is our first step into a level of consciousness which goes beyond the marketplace reality, which most people think is the only one. The next level of consciousness that the Buddha talks about is there are beings who are identical in body but diverse in perception, such as the gods of streaming radiance. This is the third station for consciousness. Now we have to remember that the first station is the worldly level, where there are also the lower beings. So what we've got to is the second jhana. The second jhana of gods of streaming radiance. Now this is a totally different way of explaining the jhanas. The Buddha never does this, hardly ever does this in any of the discourses. Usually he just says, this is the second jhana, and then you experience this, and it's the third one. Here he makes it equivalent to the levels of consciousness in other realms. And these other realms also, now this is also an important point, if one stops at any of those levels of jhana, and of course has not let go of craving, this is exactly where one gets reborn if the jhana has been perfected. So if we have perfected second jhana, have the joy as an overriding emotion and meditation subject, that is being done at the time of our death, that's definitely where rebirth takes place. And this can be very easily also not this kind of body. Because when we have identical in body, diverse in perception, gods of streaming radiance, that level is no longer this gross body, but it's a much more subtle body. There are many words of using that, but it's just a body which doesn't have so much dukkha. There's far less dukkha there. And there's far less dukkha because the level of consciousness is joy. And the level of consciousness of second jhana is joy. Now anyone who does jhanas and doesn't do second is missing out on the most important one, because this is actually our entry point into getting further. Because if we don't enjoy what we're doing, we are not going to do it. So joy is the very important point where we can see that it is possible to go further. Now people very often find this very difficult to have joy in second jhana, because it's very unknown to have joy without outer conditions. Most people have never experienced that in their lives, and so they don't even know what to look for, where to go, what is this joy. The other aspect which we have to also take into account is the fact that these jhanas bring particular insights. And the Buddha talks about that at the end. Because if the jhanas are done properly and to the point where they are done with real depth, they bring enlightenment. But enlightenment doesn't come just from sitting nicely in joy. It's impossible. Enlightenment comes from the fact that one has seen what all this is all about. And it has to have reference to dependent arising. That's why the Buddha has put it at the end of dependent arising. So joy, second jhana, which is they're called gods of streaming radiance, it feels radiant. The second jhana has to have a feeling of radiance about it. And it has to have the understanding at the end, not while one is doing it, that this is independent of outer conditions, and therefore disenchantment with the world has to set in. Disenchantment in Pali is nibbida, and it's one step before being able to have the cut-off point. The cut-off point is the next one, as viraga. That's dispassion. But first has to come disenchantment with the world. And disenchantment will only come when there's something better. Because as long as one only knows what the world has to offer, one's going to buy it. Somehow or other, one can afford it. And then one's going to get it, and if it doesn't work out, one's going to try something else. But if there's something entirely different and much, much better available within oneself, inside of oneself, then, of course, the mind can quickly realize that to be independent of outer condition is the first step into freedom. Because independence is freedom. As long as we're dependent, we are really slaves. And what are we slaves to? Our sense contacts. They're supposed to be nice. And that includes the mind contacts. Well, nobody ever manages to have them all nice. They just don't appear that way. They appear as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's their nature. So when we are able to have the entry into this, then a totally different realization arises. Now anyone who takes meditation seriously, or even halfway seriously, can be concentrated enough for that. All one has to do is let the world be. As I said at the beginning of the course, they're perfectly happy to get on without us. They've been doing it for weeks now, and nobody's complaining. So why are we trying to be with the world if they are not trying to be with us? What's so important over there? Somebody who didn't do the right things decades ago? Or somebody who didn't do the right thing yesterday? Or something that's supposed to happen next week? That's past and future. Be with it now. Anyone who takes meditation even halfway seriously can get enough concentration to be able to get into first and second jhana. First and second and third are really not very difficult. But, okay, there's a but. One has to be able to give oneself. If one can't give oneself, if one's constantly holding back, trying to be me, and trying to have all these ideas about me, it's not possible. One has to be able to give oneself totally to what one is doing, without any holding back, without any ideas, just falling into it. And that is where the ego is constantly in strife. The ego that constantly keeps talking and saying, I'm this, I'm that, I want this, I want that. I'd like to be concentrated, but. And then, but, ... whatever the but is. Giving oneself. Now, a person who can easily do loving kindness will find this much easier. A person who has difficulty with loving kindness will find this much more difficult. And as I said before, loving kindness can be a very good entry point, and is often used for that. not only for that, obviously, but loving-kindness meditation is often used as an entry point. Now, the very first of the jhanas, which I want to go back to now in order to make it complete, is sensation. And as I said, easy to do if you can do loving-kindness. And again, we know from that, when we've done it, that there's no need to constantly have the worldly consciousness, because it's totally unsatisfactory. There's no need to have something that's totally unsatisfactory. What for? Why do people hang on to these things that are so unsatisfactory and complain and are unhappy about it and have all sorts of problems with a capital P? Just let it all go. We don't have to have it. It's totally unnecessary. So all we have to do is either have the loving kindness concentrated enough so that the warmth of it arises, or keep concentrated enough on any other meditation subject so that the mind stops telling stories. The storytelling of the mind is nothing but an ego confirmation. Look at me, I know. That's all it is. The storytelling of the mind is just reaffirming that there is an ego and a me. And the more we do that, the less happiness we can have. Because with that, we don't get the happiness. So these are the first 3 levels of stations, the Buddha calls it, levels of consciousness. That's just the translation. Now then, the next one. There are beings who are identical in body and identical in perception, such as the gods of refulgent beauty. This is the 4th station for consciousness. Now, these refulgent beauty gods, they are a little higher than these others. Now, the word God is actually a translation of either Deva or Brahma. And usually, it's divided into Deva realms and Brahma realms. In this case, it isn't. Now, whether that's the translator's fault or not, I don't know. But the Deva realms are the ones, and I'll explain that right now because I am talking about the different realms and levels. They are right above us. And number 6, the one right above us, are the Bhuma Devas. And Bhuma means earth. They're the earth Devas. And they're the ones that sit in cabbages and live in trees, and people in Fintown have been seeing them for years. And they're the kind of devas that people can see. Not everybody, of course, but some people can see them. And very often there are lots of fairy tales and stories and fables and folk fables about them, where there are little gnomes or things like that, and that help people, and which these stories have, of course, a basis in truth. So Bhuma Devas are earth devas. And the word Deva means a being which is in a very subtle body and of a higher level than what the human being is. Now, after that, there come many Deva realms. They come from number 6, and they go through number 27. 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31 are the Brahma realms, the 4 highest. And they are actually called the Brahma realms because they also have no bodies at all. No bodies, just minds. But here it's explained differently, because the Buddha brings it down to 7 levels. So he doesn't bring it out into the Devas, but he just talks about these different. Now here he's got gods of streaming radiance, immeasurable radiance, limited radiance, and then abundant fruit, refulgent beauty, immeasurable beauty, and limited beauty. Well, it's 3rd and 4th jhana. And as limited as it may be, then it is not so satisfying. But it has with it a totally different ambience on what we usually have. The 3rd jhana, the mind has been completely infused with joy, and therefore there are no wishes left. And so it is a state of wishlessness, contentment, which is due to the fact that nothing can be thought of at the time that one would want. This is a totally different state and a totally different level of consciousness from any kind of consciousness that we usually have. Usually we want something. And if we don't, we fall asleep. That's the two kinds of things that we usually do with our mind. We want something or we fall asleep. So as we have here total awareness and become aware of the fact that it is possible to want nothing, it's a first time, it's a new experience, and it brings with it a kind of inner peace that has never been known before. And I'm talking about when it's the first time. That inner peacefulness has never been known before because we never knew what it's like not to want anything. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, therefore, we can see that this is on an equal level as having these devas, the higher level of devas, who are still in the, what are called the karma loka, which loka is location, realm. And karma is K-A-M-A, not karma, but it is the sense or the sensual realm. Now we are steeped in the sensual realm. We are really drowning in it. And all our outer conditions in the world are nothing but trying to drown us in it. But even the devas of the higher realms, and these are already the higher devas, are still in the sensual realm. And they are wishless because they can get anything they want. And the story says that there is a wish-fulfilling gem. And sometimes we can see Buddha statues standing, mostly when there's a standing Buddha statue coming out of Burma, but now being made in Thailand, a wooden one which has sort of glittering insets of glass, which is supposed to look like jewels. And in one hand, usually the right one, there's a sort of like a seed. Well, that's a wish-fulfilling gem. And it's held with 2 or 3 fingers. And they're supposed to just rub that and get whatever they want. And that is, of course, has nothing to do with enlightenment, mind you. And nothing at all. But it is the equivalent to the 3rd jhana. Because we've got exactly what we wanted. We've got the joy, so now we don't have to have any wishes left. So these are these devas that are in the karma loka, in the sensual realm, but they have a really nice life. And also the story says that because they don't have any dukkha, or very little anyway, practically none, they don't practice. So you can now also liken that to people whose lives are, maybe they're enormously rich, and they are healthy, and they do what they please, and they don't know that they're having dukkha, so of course they don't practice. Why should they? Everything is all right. So that kind of level of consciousness where everything is fine because you can just get it. Naturally, it's not a very high level of consciousness, but then it's only the 3rd jhana. And the same thing here, it goes with this level is also including the 4th jhana. And we can see also here in the commentary or exposition on this part of the sutta that the first 4 jhanas are not being very much appreciated. It's the next 4 that are being appreciated. That's very interesting because usually that isn't the case. Usually they are all appreciated as a concentrative attainment. But here, the first 4 are not considered to be anything special. Well, they aren't really. I mean, they are what the mind can do. But the 4th one is included here in this one, that this is the 4th station of consciousness. And now the 4th one, which then deepens this peacefulness, of course there are no wishes there, and deepens the peacefulness, then would be on an equivalent level as these higher devas who are immeasurably beautiful, and refulgent beauty and abundant fruit. So that's the fourth station. So they are it's a higher level than the radiance one. There's 3 different kind of radiance, and there are 4 different kind of beauty. So this is the fourth jhana, which has, when one comes out of it, that absolutely and utterly beautiful experience of having had complete peace. Now this fourth jhana also has the ability to give the mind mental energy, because nothing is happening. The mind doesn't have to do anything. See, when we think, then the mind is engaged and has to work. And when we sleep, the mind is dreaming and is working. So it's constantly working. It never gets any moment where it has really a regeneration or a resurrection of its energy. So the fourth jhana is that particular jhana where the resurrection and regeneration of energy takes place. So that when the mind comes out of that, it has a feeling of being very sharp, very clear, not bothered, not having to worry about anything, and being able to penetrate. It has that feeling about it. So that's a very beautiful feeling. So we have that liking there of fourth jhana and fourth level of consciousness. And it's an interesting analogy that the Buddha is making here, because again also it applies to the fact that if one dies in any of those states, these are the states one gets reborn in, which later on the Buddha of course explains it's not desirable at all, because it's just as impermanent as we are. It lasts longer in some stages, where they're longer living than we are. But again, because they are much better concentrated than we are, the longer life does not seem any longer. Now you have all probably noticed by now that if you really get concentrated, the hour goes by very fast. And if you're not concentrated at all, you think it's practically half a day, and you wish you hadn't come. So it's a matter, time is not a constant and not a given. It is depending on concentration. And in the higher realms, the concentration is much better and much stronger, obviously, because the fourth jhana has brought one there. So this enormous time span that these beings have is not considered to be very long. But there are many stories about this time spans. And now these first 4 are the jhanas of the fine material realm. Now the fine material realm is number 1 to 4. And this fine material realm is considered to be very close to what we are experiencing in the human consciousness, on a different level, of course. But we all know what it's like to have pleasant sensation. We also know what it's like to be joyful, even though the kind of joy we have otherwise is not comparable. But it's still we know what it's like to have some joy. And we also know what it's like to be contented. And we also know what it's like to be peaceful at times. I mean, we've all managed to have a few moments of peacefulness in our lives. So, although these jhana states are much, much stronger and independent of outer conditions, they still have reference to the human condition, and because of that are not considered to be sufficient for enlightenment, if there is to be an enlightenment which is the most desirable one, which is on both levels. Now, again, the Buddha says that there is through wisdom the possibility of enlightenment even after the lower jhanas, but the higher jhanas bring with it an enlightenment which is complete, a totality of enlightenment which has with it the letting go of all clingings, of all conditions which are possible to have. So this is the ideal one. He calls it, there is no other liberation in both ways higher or more sublime. So that's when he talks about the higher jhanas. But it's possible also with the lower ones. Now, after having been able to get into the lower ones, into the first four, that too is not enough, getting into them. What is said is that not only has one to be able to get in and out at any time one wishes, and stay in them as long as one wants to, and be able to get into any one of them without having to go through all of them. One also has to experience them to the fullness so that one is able to stay in them long enough so that in this liberation of the higher jhanas, one no longer has this idea of this body. In other words, it brings with it the complete liberation from the body. And then the understanding of that brings the liberation of mind. So it's not only just getting in and out or hitting it by accident. It is a pathway which has to have such depth to it that it's possible to get away from the wrong views which we have already discussed. So then, after one has been able to go through the four, then comes the other four, the next four. And the first one, the Buddha says, there are beings who, through the complete surmounting of perceptions of material form, the passing away of perception of impingement, sense impingement, and non-attention to perceptions of diversity, contemplating space is infinite, arrive at the base of the infinite space. This is the fifth station for consciousness. Now this is not uninteresting because it's a little more elaborate than what the Buddha usually says about the fifth jhana. Very often, most of the time he says, fifth jhana is the base of infinite space, period. And that's it. So here he goes a little further, and that's quite interesting. The mind surmounts the perception of material form. This one here. One surmounts the perceiving of this form. And it can very well be that the mind starts at this material form and goes outward. And as it goes outwards, there's no perception of impingement. There's no sense contact. Nothing. In other words, no thinking.